afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Charlie Gondim. I own WingingItAviary. I don't know, I'm a new store at Lindenhurst. This is Brent Gattis. Brent and I both serve on the board for the American Federation of Aviculture. Brent is the second vice president, and he's here today to speak to us about upcoming legislation and what we have to look forward to with some of our birds and other animals, as a matter of fact, not just birds.
Thank you all for having me here today. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm normally pretty loud. Y'all can probably tell I'm a Texan. So I'm a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. I do mostly animal issues. I represent a lot of different agriculture clients. And y'all can feel free to, I have all kinds of useless information. So we can get into biotech, we can get into animal rights, we can get into whatever y'all want to get into. But first and foremost, I'm an animal nut, self-described. You'll see this is our family brand. It's a 4G. There's 4 members of my family. Last name is Gattis, of course. We own and operate a ranch in Texas where we raise registered quarter horses and beef-master cattle. I have a wonderful mother and father who indulge me in anything animal-wise that I ever wanted to do. When my dad was an ag teacher, and my mother was a home economics teacher. So I come from a teaching background. And when I was 4 years old, we moved to Houston so that my dad could take a job to run the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. So my dad ran a rodeo, my mother was a home economics teacher. And we moved into a neighborhood off of 100 acres, and I had every animal imagined in the backyard of this neighborhood house. Birds, homing pigeons, rabbits, every 4-H project you can imagine. So very soon we had to end up moving to a 5-acre property just to indulge me in what I wanted to do. And my mother made a fatal flaw. She said that I could have any animal that I ever wanted as long as it wasn't an exotic bird. My grandfather immediately ixnayed this, being a good grandfather, and went out and bought me a parakeet at the local store. And when I came home from my grandparents' house, the parakeet was delivered, and that started a lifelong passion with raising birds, keeping birds, having birds as pets, and for that matter, all types of other animals. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had about 250 cockatiels and about 40 large parrots, not to mention numerous other animals that I left my mother, who is a saint, to take care of while I went to college. But while I was in high school, I started to work for an exotic animal ranch south of Houston in Alvin, Texas, called Lyle Wildlife Park. And we had everything. We had giraffes, and I've had a lifelong passion with giraffes, and that's a whole other story. We had rhinos, and I was a tour guide, so I would take people around on these tours. And for instance, I always tell the story that, you know, we would take people on the rhinos, and rhinos were in this cable pen, and they would stick their head out of the cable pen, and we'd feed them pellets, and I would be there talking about rhinos and rhino conservation. And my favorite trick was that I would put my foot up on the rhino's horn, and I would stand up on the cable, and he would pitch his head back, and I would fly about 6 feet in the air. And the kids and everybody loved it and everything else. Today, that's probably illegal under USDA rules, but at the time, you know, it was a pretty good way to grow up. I told you that my father ran a rodeo. I by far didn't have a normal childhood by some instances. By my instance, I thought that it was fairly normal. But my father did run a rodeo in Houston. And just to give you an idea, that's one of the performances. 70,000 people a night, 28 days solid, 23,000 volunteers. It's a pretty big deal, and all of the money goes to education. It goes for kids and education. So I got here last night. Robin Chewakis and Melanie, who are both with AFA and others, we were talking, and they said what I needed to do today was to scare y'all. And to make you understand why legislation and what's going on is so important. So I'll start that with telling a little story. a friend of mine says, he's from Missouri. He likes to say, to kind of emphasize that we shouldn't be all trusting of government. Now, how many people in this room know what a revenuer is? Yeah. Those of us of the generation know that revenuers are those people that are from the government that are going out to look for people distilling whiskey in order to illegally sell moonshine and everything else. So he's from this rural county in Missouri. So a revenuer had been running after this family who had a still and couldn't catch him. Wasn't able to catch him in anything else. And so he's driving along one day and the son of this family is in the front yard, 12-year-old boy. And he walks up to him and he says, "Son, where are your parents?" And the little boy says, "Well, Mom and Dad are down in the holler with the still right now." And he goes, "Oh, really?" He goes, "Well, can you take me there?" And the kid goes, "Well, I could take you there for a quarter." And the guy goes, "Well, I'll give you a quarter. That's not a problem." And so the kid goes, is standing there, and there's this awkward silence. And the guy goes, "Well, take me to your mom and dad." And the kid goes, "Well, how about my quarter?" And he said, "Well, I'll give you a quarter when we get back." And he said, "Sir, you're not coming back." Noticeable distrust of government. Anyways, how many of y'all are actually members of AFA, American Federation of Voters? That's pretty good. We're going to try to convince y'all all today that you need to be members and why you need to be members and those type of things. So I'll start off with scaring. So most of you are probably pet owners, right?
Yes.
Just correct. So I'm a lobbyist, so I'll back up a second. So what got me to Washington was when I worked for this exotic animal park, ostriches were all the rage. And we were bringing over people from Zimbabwe to teach us how to raise ostriches because they were raising commercial ostriches over there. And at the time, you couldn't leave Zimbabwe with anything but some personal items. And so these people would bring over these hand-carved ostrich eggs. And me as a 14, 15-year-old enterprising young boy decided that this would be a great gift item to sell if I could just import it. Now, I don't want to date myself, but this was pre-internet. You couldn't just email Zimbabwe. It wasn't that easy, and everything else. So I worked through them because I was working with some of these people at the park, and I found somebody, a friend of theirs that was in Zimbabwe, to buy these eggs for me and to ship them to me and those type of things. And in doing that, you had to put up with, you would call Zimbabwe and the phone line would be down for 3 weeks. That was just Zimbabwe at the time, and probably still Zimbabwe today. And so as a 14, 15-year-old boy, I started importing these hand-carved ostrich eggs. I actually ran an ad in the Wall Street Journal, did fairly well at it, didn't get rich, but did fairly well at it. Well, to import an ostrich egg, you have to go through the U.S. Customs Office. You have to have a CITES permit to prove that these ostrich eggs weren't taken out of the wild from some endangered species. You have to go through U.S. Fish and Wildlife to make sure that you're not trafficking in wildlife materials. You have to go through USDA to make sure that you're not importing some dreaded disease. And at the time, you had to go through the World Bank. So there's 5 federal agencies, all of which wanted their own sets of paperwork and their own sets of things and everything else. So I thought, if I could go learn government from the inside out, that I would be that much better off at doing business. So after I went to Texas A&M, they had a congressional internship program, and I decided I would go to Washington, and I would stay there a year, year and a half, get it on my resume, move home, and start my own business and everything else. That was 18 years ago. I interned. I should tell y'all that, number one, I'm not politically correct. I'm over the Republican thing, and I'm over the Democratic thing. I just want people sent to Washington that can sit in a proverbial smoky room and cut a deal. That's what we need in Washington these days. But getting back to why I should scare you all to death. So we have a lot of legislation and things going on, and I'm going to use Endangered Species Act as an example. So last year in Virginia, as many of y'all know, they started listing, U.S. Fish and Wildlife started listing new cockatoo species and new macaw species onto the endangered species list. And most pet owners think that this doesn't really involve them, or why it doesn't involve them. So you have to have a little bit of history here. In 1972 and 1974, the states were running to beat the federal government in passing endangered species legislation because it was all the rage. The Silent Spring had come out, and those type of things, and politicians being politicians in the way that they are, they wanted to do something. We got to prove to people that we are doing something. So the state of Virginia, as one example, and there's 26 other states where there are laws like this, passed a law saying that you could not own an endangered species, period. Okay, sounded pretty good in 1972. We thought of endangered species in 1972 as panda bears. I mean, who's really going to own a panda bear? It's not really that type of thing. Fast forward to 2013. We're listing species, and the blue-throated macaw was the example that we used in Virginia. We list the blue-throated macaw. There are literally hundreds of blue-throated macaws in the state of Virginia. Now, what's interesting about the history of blue-throated macaws is that if you really go back and look at the history of the birds, we up until the 1980s didn't even know that they were a separate and distinct species. We thought that they were a mutation that were coming in, or a juvenile blue and gold at the time. Then we found out that they were a unique species, and so we imported some. We imported about 140 birds total. Not a lot of birds when you consider what came through the import stations back in the day and everything else. But this was a small, distinct population of birds in the wild, and to this day is the same. I would argue that they're not even endangered. They were never that large of a population. They never existed that way in the wild, and from a conservation perspective, that's the way it is. But Fish and Wildlife, in their infinite wisdom, because they were petitioned by the animal rights and environmental community, decided that they would uplist the species and make it a controlled species. Well, suddenly, you have hundreds of people in Virginia and other states around the country that are now felons. You're a felon. So if you own one of those species, and blue-throated macaws are just one species, technically, you are a felon. So we went to the state of Virginia, and we passed a bill, or we started working on a bill called the American Federation of Agriculture. And we started working on a bill to make it legal to own endangered species. And if you go read the law that we got passed and signed by the governor last year, it says that you can own, breed, and sell endangered species in the state of Virginia. It's the only state currently that has that type of legislation that actually prescribes exactly what you can do with your bird. So when we're doing that, I show up at the state capitol along with Buddy Waskey, who's a member of AFA, who started working on this with his state senator. And so Fish and Wildlife comes up to me and they say, Brent, we don't need to do this. We don't intend to regulate your birds. We don't want anything to do with it, but we don't want to pass a law. To which I say to Fish and Wildlife, well, that's all fine and good, but it still makes me a felon. It still makes me, regardless of whether or not you intend to regulate it or not, it still makes me and all of these other people, including yourselves, that own any of these birds, a felon. Well, we don't intend to regulate it. Well, that's fine and good, and we'll get into this in a little bit. The problem with the animal business, and y'all all know this, animal business is both a science and an art. All of you who keep birds know that there's a lot of science behind keeping birds, and there's a lot of art behind keeping birds. And you don't get any two groups of people that fight more than scientists and artists. And y'all all fight, and you all do it every other day. So all it's going to take is for your neighbor or your fellow bird person or whatever else to get mad at you and then report you and insist to the authorities, whether they be county authorities or whatever else, that they go in and take these birds. And under the law, it's pretty clear. You're not allowed to own them. So what happens to them? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen to them. Government has no place to put them. They're not going to put them anywhere. And for those of you who are in the sanctuary business out here, and I call it the sanctuary business, probably piss some people off, but for those of you that are in the sanctuary business, you're not exempt. That's not the way the law works. And you as a pet owner are not exempt. So if you own, if you're a sanctuary and you have 120 blunking cockatoos, they got to go somewhere. And the government's going to euthanize them. That's what they're going to do, because they don't want to deal with them. They don't have the ability to deal with them. They don't have the way to deal with them. You're not going to export them to the wild. You're not going to do any of this other stuff.